Don't mock. I'm not a fool. And people who know me personally know that I am not a fool. But I won't get into the details of those. I just want people to realize that I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool.
Hey there, it's Tony here and welcome to episode 55 of the Dumb Leaders podcast. And today I'm sharing a story about the importance of communication. This is Dumb Leaders in the News. Dumb Leaders in the News 101. And once again, I'm going back into one of the greatest aspects or the greatest organisations where a lot of dumb leadership comes out of, right? So it's the organisation called the National Rugby League here in Australia. It's called the NRL. And the Rugby League is a fantastic sport, but it's never short of a story. It's never short of a story. And it's never short of a story around dumb leadership. So I really ask, even if you're not a rugby league fan, stay around and listen to this one, because I know that the value that you'll get in terms of communication for this will be very much worth the effort of navigating your way through something that you may not necessarily be a passionate fan about. So today, the important lesson, it's an amazing lesson around communication and the importance of communication for organisations. And this lesson comes from what I would term as a right royal stuff-up in rugby league. And often when you think in the terms of the National Rugby League, that you don't think it can ever get any worse in terms of leadership administration. Along comes the Newcastle Knights and their handling of the exit of their coach, Nathan Brown. And it really just set the new benchmark for dumb in the National Rugby League competition. And as I said, even if you don't follow rugby league, please listen in, because the lesson is absolutely relevant to all leaders at all levels. And it's a powerful lesson because it is such a public display of dumbness, and one that just navigates it. It just meandered along to what ultimately was a conclusion that it's sort of like that unsatisfactory conclusion, but ultimately it's happened. So the short summary, and I'll keep it short, and once again, I'm not privy to any of the insider dealings, so if you're one of those people that know everything that happened within the club, that's fine and dandy, congratulations. Ultimately, I work around what becomes publicly available. And everything that I speak about in today's podcast is information that is publicly available through news papers and sporting journalism. So short summary was that Nathan Brown was the coach of the Newcastle Knights, and he took over the club from former coach Wayne Bennett a number of years ago. Now, the club at that time had an ageing roster and absolute salary cap drama. So there was a rebuilding process that was needed, and there was a focus around development of young players. So far so good. But it was no surprise that over the last couple of seasons and the first seasons of Brown's tenure was that they finished last in the competition. They achieved what we call the wooden spoon. They got the wooden spoon because they finished last. Now this year, and I guess in some respects the previous season, they started to show some promise. And this season especially, although they're a bit inconsistent, they had periods of really amazingly good, strong, consistent play. But they also had periods where they'd lose 6 games in a row. But they were playing for a place in the finals. So in the rugby league competition, in the National Rugby League competition, it's a top 8 scenario. So out of the 16 teams, 8 make it through into the finals or the playoffs, whatever term that you're more comfortable with. And they were playing for a playoff spot. They were in reach of a playoff spot. Until the club released a press statement saying that they were severing ties with Nathan Brown, the coach. But it was an amicable severing of the ties. It was a mutual decision, and that Brown would see out the remainder of the season. So at this particular time of the release, there were 3 games left, and if the Knights had won, those games, this podcast is being recorded. They've still got 1 game, but they're now out of the finals playoff reach. But they needed to win all 3 to have a chance of making the semi-finals or the finals or the playoffs. But mostly it was an amicable parting of the ways, and that Brown would see out the remainder of the season. And I guess this is where the shitstorm started to happen. The club released a statement, and it was a very respectful statement around Brown, stating that he will be remembered as one of the most important and influential coaches in the history of the club. So that's a pretty big, kudos that you would give a coach. And, no matter what was the reasoning behind the parting of the ways, ultimately, publicly, the club was saying Nathan Brown has been important to the club and the history of the club. Not just recent history, it was history of the club. And what I know and what we see of Nathan Brown is he's quite a humble character. He's honest to a day. And based on what you read publicly, he realised that his time was limited, that the club was looking elsewhere, and he initiated some of those strong discussions that needed to be had around the future tenure of his coaching. But ultimately, the decision was made between him and the CEO, and it was announced. So there was mutual respect from all parties, and it was all well and good. So up until now, everyone's thinking, yeah, okay, that's isn't that good that they can part ways and still see out the season, and they're both being respectful. So I think generally, while some of the journalists were probably scratching their heads with some sort of, looking for the hidden agenda, overall it was quite a respectful parting of the ways. Until the media started asking the players what they thought. And I know that the media believe that they have a right to let the fans know, and I believe the fans need to know. So, we get caught in this catch-22 where if there isn't a story, do they generate one? Do they create one? But they asked the players, and the story came. And this is where the real dog's breakfast started to come through. So Kalen Ponga, who is a young superstar, when he asked how he felt and when he heard the news, he spoke, "I was having a strawberry thick shake, so I wasn't too unhappy." Right? What? What? I was having a strawberry thick shake, so I wasn't too unhappy. The captain of the team, Mitchell Pearce, spoke in a much longer sort of a statement. He talked about, well, it's not too uncommon these days. It's part of the business, etc., yada yada yada. And then when asked did he have any thoughts around who could coach the Knights next and get them into the position that they want to be in, he said, well, maybe my mum could. Maybe my mum could coach the team. So suggesting his mother could do the job, but not exactly the sentiments that would align with the respectful statement that the club provided, right? I think that quite rightly the media sort of disconnected. They saw this disconnect. So saw this disconnect around what the club was saying, respectful, important coach in the history of the club, and then we've got players saying, well, I was having a strawberry thick shake, so I wasn't too unhappy. So there was misalignment, and then from that, this was backed up by what can only be described as an absolutely insipid display by the team on the following weekend. So with their season on the line, they got beaten by about 40 points. So it was a comprehensive flogging. And once again, all of this just led to the media starting to look and dig and find skeletons. But I'm not going to go into that. Because ultimately, after the insipid display, Brown left. He left the club immediately. They appointed an interim coach. And we saw a bit more respect from the players in terms of public statements, right? So the players responded with a little bit more respect. The interim coach suggested the reason for their performance is that they were all mentally exhausted or mentally drained, which you know, we'll accept that on face value. It was obviously an exhausting, draining time, but once again, people make a choice, and these guys are professional sports people, and they certainly didn't make the right choice. But what was really insightful, once all of the shitstorm was sort of cleared a little bit, in an insightful and heartfelt apology on one of the TV sporting shows that he speaks on, Kalyn Ponga spoke about the circumstances surrounding his ill-fated comments. Now, in quite a, like here, it was quite a lengthy discussion, and he highlighted the respect he had for Brown and the good things that he had for Brown, but he also provided some information around the circumstances surrounding his ill-fated comments, and this is where the lesson lies. See, Ponga spoke about the fact that Coach Nathan Brown had addressed the players prior to the decision of leaving was made public, and he expressed the desire for the players not to make a big deal about it. So the coach had addressed the players, said, "Hey, look, guys, I'm leaving. It's a mutual decision. I think it's time to move on. The club believes it's time to move on. I'm still here for the rest of the season. I don't want you to make a big deal out of it." All words to that effect, right? I'll never know exactly what Brown said, but based on what Pong is saying, he'd addressed the players, and the big point was not to make a big deal about it. And based on that, this is where the problem lies. So when we're talking about communication, this is where the problem lies. So what does "don't make a big deal about it" mean to you, the listener? What does that mean to you? Because I would guarantee that for every 100 listeners, we've got maybe 70 different understandings or perceptions around "don't make a big deal about it" mean. Now, obviously, to Ponga, it meant make it lighthearted, try and make a joke of it. Okay, so I was having a strawberry thick shake. Yeah, I wasn't too unhappy. The strawberry thick shake was pretty good, you know. Yeah. I'm not making a big deal about it. What did it mean for the captain, Mitchell Pearce? Again, it was a lighthearted attempt, suggesting his mum would make a good coach. Now, I'm not saying that Pearce said that his mum would make a better coach than Brown, but when asked about his thoughts about who could be the next coach, to make a statement that your mum could coach the team is probably not what your fans want to hear. And the lesson is, when you leave communication to be interpreted by the receiver, you are heading for trouble. So in this case, "don't make a big deal of it" was an attempt by Brown, possibly, to remain humble and keep the team focused on their attempt to stay in the playoff race, right? But the players, and you could call it a lack of leadership or a lack of maturity, didn't take it that way. And they made some incredibly poor attempts around some incredibly poor judgments at being lighthearted. And overall, wrong. Now, as a leader, you should never communicate without understanding what the outcome that you want to achieve from the communication. So as a leader, you should never communicate without understanding what you want the outcome to be. And John Maxwell says the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And in this instance, there was this illusion or an assumption from Brown that communication had taken place. Now, once again, I just relate. I don't know the finer details of the conversation that the coach had had with the players, or if indeed whether Brownie had lost some of the locker room. You know, that's a term for specifically set out for sporting coaches. When they lose the locker room, that's when their tenure becomes sort of untenable, when the players don't want to play for the coach. So I don't know whether that was indeed the case. But when we look at it from public knowledge level, and we hear that Brownie had addressed the players and said, don't make a big deal of it. And then we saw the response from the players, which then backed up their interpretation of don't make a big deal about it. Lees, you can see the danger of communication. So what could have happened, right? What could have happened? And what potentially would have been a better way for Brown to have gone is for Brown to have addressed the players. So he did that right, so well done on that. He could have outlined the situation, you know, that I'm leaving the club, it's a mutual decision. We both believe that the club needs to go in a certain direction, etc., etc. But I'll be seeing the season out, and I believe that we've really got something to play for here. The finals are within our grasp, the playoffs are there, and I really want us to focus on that. Now, you are going to be asked by the media, no doubt, about your thoughts around the process. Now, we don't want the focus to be around Nathan Brown leaving the club. We want the focus to be on our football team staying in the finals race. So, and basically we want the focus to be around what it is that we're going to deliver for the remainder of the year. So, bear in mind the club has released a statement. The statement says this. So, there is a belief that Nathan Brown, right? So a little bit more detail in the conversation, a little less focus around don't make a big deal about it. Focus in on what you want them to be saying without necessarily putting the words into their mouths, and then just working through it like that. So once Brown had communicated to the team, then it was time for the CEO or the captain to actually step up and provide a role model of sorts or an outline of sorts of what the public communication was going to be all about. And this is where the focus on the club statement should have been spoken about with the team and the players, and also the belief that anything that contradicted or didn't align with that was going to create a focus, right? So we've got a coach that doesn't want to make a big deal out of it. That's awesome. That's fantastic. But at the end of the day, if you don't align with what's already out there, it's going to create a focus. It's going to create a big deal, as it did, right? And then what they could have done is then express the manner in how to deal with the media. You know, potentially saying things like, so if you're asked, you say, yes, Brownie has been incredibly important to this club, but what's most important is what happens over the next 3 weeks of the competition. We're still fighting for a finals playoff spot, and that's where our focus is. You know, of course, Brownie will be missed, but, you know, this is where we're heading. And the reality is the statements then would have been aligned, and it would have allowed the team to focus ahead for what was left of the season. And maybe they could have finished on a high. Instead of becoming mentally drained because of the shitstorm that occurred, based around their interpretation of that concept of don't make a big deal out of it. So communication is absolutely vital for leaders at all levels, right? You want and you need your messages to be clear. So you want everyone to have clarity, and that's everyone at all levels, and it's your responsibility as a leader to ensure that. It's not the receiver's responsibility to interpret the message in the way that you believe it should be done. it is your responsibility as a leader to make sure the message is clear and that the outcome from the communication has been met. Now, the other thing that I just want to talk about is the simpler the message, the more advanced your team needs to be. So Brown, to this day, is probably saying, well, I communicated that to the players because I didn't want it to be the focus, right? I told them not to make a big deal out of it. They should have been able to, so he would be quite justified he would be justifying his own actions in relation to that, right? I told the players, not to make a big deal out because I wanted them to focus in. But the simpler the message is, the more advanced the team need to be, right? And this was really drawn home to me in my corporate days, and especially when I was with Bunnings Warehouse. The reality is that the Bunnings yearly plans were incredibly simplified, right? They were very simple, and you could buy into them because of that. But underneath that simplicity, there was actions, and there was a plan, and there was a process, and so there was all these things that related back to the outlying strategy, which was simple, right? But they could do that because of the advancement and the maturity of the leadership within the company. People could look at a top line simple statement and understand what it took to achieve that. In this case, the top line statement is don't make a big deal out of it. Now, if someone was advanced enough, they would read between the lines and say, okay, so what that means is that we don't want the coach leaving to be the focus of the stories, of the media, of the attention. So we want to focus, you start making those beliefs and understandings based on your own level of maturity and or leadership. And in this case, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. What don't make a big deal out of it meant to the players was let's make a joke of it. And once that was made, there was then the disalignment, the disconnection between the official statement from the club, the players' reaction from the club, which was then backed up by an incredibly insipid display by the team, which then just poured more fuel into the fire. It was communication 101 done poorly. Done poorly. So I'm hoping that you took some real messages out of that for your leadership, your management, your business career. Your communication really needs to be clear, and you need to have a way to achieve the outcome that you want to achieve from the communication that you're putting out there. It is your responsibility. It is your responsibility as a leader to be doing that. So don't be like Dean, the dumb leader, or in this case, it's Brownie, Wayne, and Kalen, the dumb leader. Heed the lesson and be 100% the leader that you can be. Until next week, I shall see you then.
Don't mock. I'm not a fool. And people who know me personally know that I am not a fool. But I won't get into the details of those. I just want people to realize that I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool.